The evening unfolded exactly as I knew it would. An overpriced bottle of Macallan on the bar cart, the low hum of expensive laughter, and James basking in the admiration of his colleagues. The men in this room thrived on their own arrogance, their confidence built on corner office power moves and private equity deals. James was in his element. He always was, at least when he had an audience. "Ah, here she is, my lovely wife," he said as I stepped into the room, swirling his scotch as if he were holding court. "Surprised you even came down, sweetheart. Thought you'd be busy writing another cover letter." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. I smiled faintly, as if I hadn't heard that same joke a dozen times before. "Not tonight," I said smoothly, crossing the room toward the sleek, modern bar. Figured I'd let myself enjoy the company of such successful men. James' best friend, Evan, leaned against the couch, grinning. Harper, you always know how to make a man feel important." "I try," I murmured, pouring myself a drink. The truth was, I had spent the last year enduring these moments in silence, playing my part, swallowing the humiliation. James had made a sport out of reducing me in front of his colleagues, turning my supposed failures into the running joke of his career. "She's still unemployed," James announced, lifting his glass. I swear, at this point, even the grocery store wouldn't take her. The room erupted again, the men shaking their heads in mock sympathy. "You have to admire her persistence, though," Evan chimed in, smirking. "Harper, how many rejection emails now?" I let the ice in my glass clink as I tilted it slightly. "Oh, I lost count." James grinned. "Come on, give us a number. Let's see who gets closest." Honestly? I set my drink down, finally looking up. I stopped counting a while ago, but I did hear back from someone recently. James rolled his eyes. "Let me guess, volunteer work?" More laughter. More clinking glasses. I smiled, slow and deliberate. "No, actually. From the board of Zenith Systems." The shift was immediate. A heavy silence settled over the room, thick and suffocating. The amusement drained from their faces as they registered my words. James stiffened, his grip tightening around his glass. "What?" he said, his voice too casual, too forced. I took my time, letting the tension marinate, enjoying the way their bodies subtly leaned in. "You see, I've been keeping myself busy," I continued, my voice smooth. "Investing. Expanding my portfolio. And a few months ago, I found myself particularly interested in a company I know quite well." I swirled my glass, watching the way the ice shifted. Zenith Systems. The oxygen in the room seemed to thin. James let out a short, disbelieving laugh, but his eyes told a different story. "All right, Harper, I don't know what kind of joke you think you're making." "Oh, it's not a joke," I said lightly. "It's an investment." Evan sat forward, frowning. "What the hell are you talking about?" I tilted my head slightly. "I own a controlling stake in Zenith Systems." The words dropped like a bomb. It was almost comedic, the slow, dawning horror on their faces, the way their postures shifted from relaxed confidence to rigid unease. These men had built their entire world on the belief that they were untouchable, that they were the ones in control. James' face drained of color. That's impossible," he stammered. I arched a brow. "Is it?" He blinked rapidly, like he was trying to make sense of it, like the ground beneath him had suddenly disappeared. Evan frowned, looking between us. "James, what the hell is she talking about?" "I'm talking about majority voting power," I said, setting my glass down. "I'm talking about changes to leadership." My gaze settled on James, unwavering. "I'm talking about the future of this company." "No," James said, shaking his head like he could somehow undo my words. "There's no way. You don't have the money for that." I smiled again. "Are you sure?" Silence. James' throat bobbed as he swallowed. He knew my background. He knew I had worked in finance before we got married, that I had managed investment portfolios worth millions. But he had convinced himself that, because I wasn't actively working, I had no power. That I was weak. Dependent. He was wrong. "See, while you were busy making jokes at my expense," I continued, "I was busy making moves." While you were mocking me for being unemployed, I was securing boardroom votes. While you were too distracted with your own ego, I was buying the very company that gives you your paycheck. A beat of silence. You're lying, James snapped. I reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp, freshly printed document. Board meeting minutes, I said, sliding them across the table. Effective immediately, Zenith Systems is undergoing structural changes. James grabbed the papers with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the words frantically. I watched as the reality of his situation settled in, as his breath grew shallow. Evan leaned over, reading over his shoulder, his face darkening. This, James started, his voice hoarse. This is real, I finished for him. James' hands trembled slightly as he set the papers down. He looked up at me, the panic finally creeping into his expression. Harper, you. I what? I said softly. I outplayed you? His jaw clenched. This isn't over. I picked up my glass, tilting it toward him in a mock toast. Oh, darling, I murmured, my smile razor-sharp. It's only just beginning. The room remained silent, suffocated by the weight of what had just happened. I had been dismissed, mocked, belittled. But tonight I had the last laugh. And James? He had just realized who was really in control. James didn't speak for a full 30 seconds. That might not seem like much, but for a man who always had something to say, always had a quip, a boast, a smug little remark, it was a lifetime. The room still held the echo of my last words, my declaration hanging in the air like an executioner's axe. I could see it in his face, the moment his brain tried to process the shift in power, the moment his world began to tilt off its axis. His fingers curled around the papers I had handed him, his grip so tight the edges crinkled. This doesn't make sense, he said, voice thin. You don't just buy a company overnight. I didn't, I said, reaching for my drink again, taking my time. I've been buying it for years. His head snapped up. Across the room, Evan frowned, his executive instincts kicking in. Explain. Oh, I'd love to. I leaned back against the bar, the ice in my glass clinking softly as I swirled my drink. See, this all started long before James decided I was a joke. I turned my gaze to my husband. Do you remember, sweetheart? Back when we first got married, and I was still working in finance. James' mouth tightened. Of course, he remembered. When we talked about investment strategies, you always dismissed my ideas. I continued, voice light. Said I was too conservative. Too cautious. That's why I left the firm, isn't it? Because you convinced me that my way of doing things slow, strategic, deliberate wasn't aggressive enough. James didn't answer, but the flicker in his eyes told me everything. Well, guess what? I tilted my glass toward him. Turns out, my way works just fine. I turned to Evan. It started small. A few shares here, a few there. Nothing noticeable. Not under my name, of course, I was careful. Used intermediary firms, offshore holdings, anonymous trusts. Took my time. Years, actually. Because unlike some people, I glanced at James, I understand patience. Evan's brow furrowed. You're saying, you've been acquiring shares of Zenith Systems for years? I set my glass down. All while James was too busy stroking his ego to notice. James sputtered, you don't have that kind of money. I laughed softly. Oh, James. Sweet, oblivious James. I didn't need my own fortune to do it. I just needed to know how to move money. You remember my old firm, don't you? The one I worked for before I retired. James paled slightly. That firm specialized in corporate acquisitions. I smiled. So yes, I do know exactly how to buy a company. Quietly. Strategically. Without anyone realizing what's happening until it's too late. I took a sip of my drink, savoring the moment. By the time you started publicly mocking me, I already owned 12% of the company. By the time your friends joined in, 25%. And when I heard you joke about me being unemployable at last year's Christmas party, I tilted my head. Well, that's when I decided to go for the majority. James' hands were shaking now. No, there's no way the board. Oh, The board was more than happy to cooperate. I cut in smoothly. You'd be amazed how many people were looking for a reason to shift power. They just needed someone to step in. I gave him a slow, almost pitying look. And since you handed me the perfect reason on a silver platter, I figured, why not me? Evan ran a hand through his hair. Holy sh*T. The other men in the room exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't used to seeing James like this, silent, blindsided, utterly powerless. James opened his mouth, then shut it again. I watched the emotions flicker across his face: denial, anger, panic, disbelief. He was scrambling, trying to find a way to regain control. Harper, he said finally, forcing a laugh that sounded like glass cracking. Come on. This is insane. What are you even going to do with the company? You're not, he hesitated, probably realizing that finishing that sentence with qualified would be a bad idea. I arched a brow. Not capable? James flinched. Oh, don't worry. I set my drink down with a decisive clink. I don't intend to run the day-to-day operations. That's what a competent executive team is for. The words stung him. I could see it. But I will be making some changes. What changes? Evan asked sharply. I smiled. For starters? I think it's time to restructure leadership. James' eyes widened. No, he whispered. Oh, yes. I leaned in slightly. And you, darling, are no longer indispensable. James sh*T to his feet so quickly his chair nearly toppled. You can't do this. I can, I said calmly. And I already have. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. Harper, you don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. I tilted my head. I understand that you've been a negligent leader. I understand that you've been prioritizing your own power over the company's growth. And most importantly, I let my voice drop just slightly. I understand that you never saw me as a threat. The truth hit him like a punch. You, James exhaled shakily, gripping the back of his chair. You really planned this. I smiled. Every step. Evan let out a low whistle, shaking his head. Damn. She played the long game. I did, I agreed. And now? The game is over. James looked around the room as if expecting someone, anyone, to step in, to help him. But there was nothing but silence. I picked up my purse. Well, gentlemen, this has been fun. But I have a board meeting to prepare for. James' mouth opened, then closed. He looked utterly lost. Defeated. I turned toward the door but paused, glancing over my shoulder. Oh, and James. He lifted his head. Consider this your 2-week notice. And with that, I walked out, leaving my husband standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance. James didn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised. After I walked out of his little boys' club gathering, he had 2 options: face me or run. And James had always been a runner. I imagined he was pacing around some overpriced hotel suite right now, drinking too much, making frantic calls to his lawyer and whatever board members still had the spine to pick up. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. By now, he'd know the truth. There were no legal loopholes, no last-minute deals to save him. My takeover was already done. His position as CFO? Practically dead in the water. By morning, he'd be a man with a title but no power, clinging to a role that no longer needed him. And by the end of the week, he'd have nothing at all. I packed my bags that night, the way I had always imagined I might someday if I ever found the courage to leave. The house James believed was his, the one he'd shown off to guests, boasted about at parties, was nothing more than another asset I controlled. I could have fought to keep it, but why bother? I wanted nothing of his. Instead, I moved into my downtown penthouse, the one I had owned for years, quietly waiting for the day I would need it. I stood by the window that night, sipping a glass of wine as I looked down at the city. I had spent years pretending to be a woman I wasn't. The supportive wife. The struggling job seeker. The one who smiled when she was humiliated and laughed when she was dismissed. But that woman no longer existed. And James was about to realize it. The next morning, at exactly 8 a.m., the board of directors convened for an emergency meeting. James arrived looking like hell. His suit was wrinkled, his tie slightly askew. The man who usually spent hours preening in front of the mirror now looked like he had aged a decade overnight. He scanned the room, eyes darting from one board member to another, searching for support. But the atmosphere had shifted. He could feel it. I sat at the head of the table, my posture poised, my expression neutral. He hesitated. I didn't speak first. I wanted him to. I wanted to hear him beg. "What the hell is this?" he finally said, his voice hoarse. "A restructuring meeting," I replied smoothly. "We have some necessary changes to discuss." James let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You think you can just walk in here and take over? You think these people," he gestured to the board, "are just going to hand you this company?" I tilted my head slightly. "They already have." A muscle twitched in his jaw. Across the table, one of the senior board members, Richard Lancaster, cleared his throat. "James," he said, his voice calm but firm, "Harper's acquisition was legitimate. We reviewed every step. She has majority voting power now." James' eyes widened slightly. You're just going to let her destroy everything I built?" I leaned forward slightly, my hands folded neatly on the table. "You didn't build this, James." Silence. "You profited from it," I continued. "You used it. But you didn't build it." His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "And now," I said, shifting my gaze to the rest of the board, "we have decisions to make." I turned to Richard. "Let's discuss leadership adjustments, shall we?" Richard nodded, flipping through his notes. "Effective immediately, we're moving forward with the restructuring plan." I could see the moment James realized what was happening. He wasn't just losing his job. I was eliminating it. His closest allies, the executives he had protected, the ones who had enabled his arrogance, were all being replaced. One by one, their names were read aloud, their terminations effective by the end of the quarter. His fingers curled into fists. "You can't do this." I met his gaze, unflinching. "I already did." The room stayed quiet, filled only with the sound of papers shuffling, pens scratching, deals being finalized. James sat there, frozen, as his world unraveled in real time. By the time the meeting ended, the company he once controlled, the life he once controlled, was no longer his. And for the first time since I had known him, James Thorne had nothing to say. He came to the penthouse that night. I wasn't surprised. I had been waiting for him. I heard the knock, slow and deliberate, followed by the sound of him shifting on his feet. I let him wait a full minute before opening the door. He looked wrecked. His suit was gone, replaced by jeans and a rumpled button-down, the kind of casual wear he only ever resorted to when his carefully curated image was slipping. "Harper," he said, exhaling shakily. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "James." His eyes flicked past me, toward the inside of the penthouse. "Can we talk?" "We just did," I said coolly. "This morning. At the board meeting." His throat bobbed. That's not what I meant." I tilted my head slightly. "Then be specific." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I mean us." I didn't flinch. Didn't blink. "There is no us." A flash of something crossed his face, anger, desperation, disbelief. "Harper," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. You don't have to do this. We can fix this." I let out a slow breath, pushing the door open wider. "You want to talk?" I said. "Fine. Let's talk." He stepped inside cautiously, like he didn't recognize the space, like he knew, on some level, that he was no longer welcome. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the sleek furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the expensive art on the walls. "Jesus," he muttered. "You had this place the whole time?" I nodded. His gaze snapped back to mine. "Why didn't you tell me?" I gave him a small, sharp smile. "Because you never asked." His shoulders sagged slightly. I don't understand." His voice broke, just slightly. "Why, Harper? Why do this? Why destroy me?" I sighed, tilting my head. "Do you remember what you told me last year?" He frowned. "What?" "At your birthday party." I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. When your friends were joking about my job rejections, and I swallowed, my voice turning to steel. You said, she's nothing without me. James' mouth opened, then shut. He remembered. And now he understood. I turned, walking toward the kitchen, opening a drawer. When I turned back, I was holding a thick manila envelope. I tossed it onto the counter between us. What is this? He asked hesitantly. Divorce papers. His breath hitched. I'll make this easy for you, I said. Sign them, and you walk away with a settlement. Try to fight me, and I'll take everything. James' hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. I watched as the last piece of him broke. And for the first time in years, I was free. James was quiet when he left my penthouse that night. Too quiet. I knew that look in his eyes, the way his mind was still racing, searching for a way out, a way to win. And I knew James well enough to understand one thing. He wasn't done fighting. He couldn't accept losing. Couldn't handle the thought of me walking away not just free, but victorious. So, I waited. I knew it was only a matter of time before he made his next move. And sure enough, he did. The first sign came the next morning. A flood of articles hit the business news circuits, each one filled with anonymous sources whispering about my supposed hostile takeover of Zenith Systems. Zenith Systems in crisis as CFO's wife stages boardroom coup. Power grab or personal vendetta? Harper Sinclair's sudden takeover raises questions. Industry experts question if she's qualified to lead. It was almost impressive how fast the smear campaign spread. James had clearly called in every favor he had. Every journalist, every corporate connection, every executive buddy willing to sell me out for a quote. I sipped my coffee, scrolling through the headlines, barely suppressing a smile. I knew exactly what he was trying to do. James was playing the only game he knew, perception. If he couldn't beat me in the boardroom, he'd try to destroy my reputation instead. Make me look like a bitter, vengeful wife who had burned down a company just to get back at him. He wanted me to panic, to defend myself, to react. So I did the one thing he didn't expect. I stayed silent. Let him run his mouth. Let him plant his little stories. Let him believe, for one brief, desperate moment, that he was still in control. Because while he was busy fighting me in the press, I was burying him in the boardroom. By noon, the emergency board meeting was in session. I sat at the head of the table, calm and composed, while the directors debated over the headlines. This is an optics nightmare, one of them said. Investors are already nervous, another added. We can't afford this kind of negative press. I let them talk. Let them air their concerns. Then, finally, I spoke. I agree, I said smoothly. We can't afford this kind of negative press. James, sitting across from me, perked up slightly, thinking he had me on the ropes. So, I continued, I suggest we clear things up. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. Then, I slid it across the table. James' entire body stiffened. He recognized it instantly. What's this? Richard Lancaster, the senior board member, asked as he opened the folder. I leaned back in my chair, my expression unreadable. An independent audit, I said casually. Commissioned 3 months ago. Silence. James froze. Richard flipped through the pages, his frown deepening. Jesus Christ, he muttered. I rested my chin on my hand. That, gentlemen, is a detailed report of James' financial misconduct. All around the table, eyes widened. James' voice was tight, controlled. This is bullsh*T. Is it? I tilted my head. Because it looks to me like a very clear pattern of fraud. More silence. James' face drained of color. I'm sure you all remember the Westbridge acquisition, I continued, my voice casual. A promising partnership until the deal mysteriously fell through at the last minute. Murmurs of agreement. Well, I tapped the folder. According to these records, James was making backdoor deals to sabotage the merger. Shock rippled through the room. James clenched his jaw. That's not. And then there's the misuse of company funds, I continued. Charging personal expenses to Zenith Systems accounts. Overinflated budgets. Payments made to consulting firms that don't exist. I locked eyes with him. Shall I continue? James looked like he wanted to strangle me. But he couldn't. Because I had proof. And he knew it. Richard leaned forward, his expression serious. James, if even half of this is true. It's not, James snapped. Richard ignored him. This company cannot afford a public scandal. His eyes met mine. Harper, what do you suggest? I smiled. I suggest, I said, locking James out of his own fate, we release a statement. I pulled out another set of documents. A press release acknowledging the concerns, but reassuring investors that leadership changes are already in motion. James' mouth fell open. You're not. Oh, I am. My voice was soft, lethal. Effective immediately, James is being placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. James *T up from his chair, slamming his fists against the table. You can't do this. Richard didn't even flinch. Actually, she can. James' chest rose and fell rapidly. His anger was slipping into panic. He hadn't expected me to fight back this hard. I stood up slowly, adjusting my suit jacket. You wanted a public battle, James? I murmured, stepping closer to him. Now you have one. Then, just loud enough for only him to hear. And trust me, I'm going to win. I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving James standing there ruined. By the next morning, the media narrative had flipped. The headlines now read, Zenith Systems CFO under investigation for financial misconduct. Harper Sinclair moves to stabilize company after husband's alleged fraud. Sources say CEO's leadership, exactly what Zenith needs. James had tried to destroy me. Instead, he destroyed himself. And I wasn't even done yet. James was out of options. By the end of the week, his administrative leave became an official termination. His name was scrubbed from the Zenith Systems website. His office was cleared out. His company credit cards were revoked. Every executive perk he had once bragged about gone. I thought that would be the end of it. I underestimated his desperation. Because James wasn't just angry. He was reckless. And reckless men are dangerous. It started with whispers. Zenith's IT department flagged suspicious activity in the internal servers, unauthorized attempts to access sensitive financial records. At first, I thought it was just James trying to cover his tracks. Then the cyber attack happened. At exactly 3:17 a.m., a massive breach attempt triggered every security alarm in our system. A coordinated attack targeting employee payroll, shareholder reports, and classified acquisition plans. The goal? Destabilization. Someone wanted Zenith Systems to collapse. And I already knew who it was. By 9 a.m., I was sitting in the IT security war room. Screens flickered with firewall data, intrusion attempts, and real-time countermeasures. My head of cybersecurity, Claire, paced in front of a massive monitor. It was sloppy, she said. A brute force attack, trying to overload the servers. But the real kicker. She pulled up a log. The IP address was traced to a personal laptop. I leaned forward. Whose? She smirked. Your soon-to-be ex-husband. I exhaled slowly. James was getting careless. Do we have evidence? I asked. Claire nodded. More than enough. She tapped the screen. Login timestamps. Data extraction attempts. Even an encrypted message he tried to send to a competitor. I smiled. That's all I needed. Then I picked up my phone and made a call. By noon, James was in handcuffs. The FBI arrested him in broad daylight right outside his hotel in full view of dozens of reporters. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Former Zenith CFO arrested for corporate sabotage. Insider sources confirm cyber attack linked to disgraced executive. Harper Sinclair emerges victorious after husband's downfall. James had spent years belittling me, mocking me, dismissing me. Now, his mugged *T was splashed across every business news site in the country. And me? I was untouchable. That night, I received one final message from James. A single email, sent from a burner account. You think you've won. But you'll always be nothing without me. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I deleted it. Because James? James was nothing. And I was finally free. The morning after James' arrest, I woke up to silence. No passive-aggressive comments over breakfast. No arrogant chuckles from the next room. No lingering presence that made me shrink into myself without even realizing it. Just peace. I stretched, letting the golden morning light spill into my penthouse. I didn't have to check my phone to know that every news outlet was still running the story, his downfall, my victory. But I wasn't thinking about James anymore, because James was irrelevant. And for the first time in years, I could finally breathe. The day passed in a blur of calls, meetings, and congratulations from industry leaders. Zenith Systems was stronger than ever. Stock prices had stabilized. Investors felt confident in my leadership. Our cybersecurity team had sealed every possible breach, ensuring no one could ever pull what James had tried again. By 3 p.m., I received word that James had been formally charged. Fraud, embezzlement, cybercrimes. His lawyer tried to negotiate a deal, but the FBI wasn't interested. By the time he posted bail, his accounts were frozen, his assets under investigation, and his entire career destroyed. I should have felt vindicated, but mostly, I just felt done. That evening, I stood on my penthouse balcony, watching the city lights flicker below. My phone buzzed with a message from Richard Lancaster. "Welcome to the future, Harper. We made the right choice." I smiled, setting my phone aside. For years, I had played small. Let a man with less intelligence, less vision, and far too much arrogance dictate my worth. No more. I had built this life. I had earned this power. I had won, not just against James, but against every man who had ever underestimated me. And the best part? I wasn't just free. I was unstoppable. Epilogue. A month later, Zenith Systems was thriving. James, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale. His name was synonymous with failure. His former colleagues avoided him. Every attempt to rebuild his career was met with doors slammed in his face. One night, I received an email from him. A weak, pitiful message. "We could have worked this out. You didn't have to destroy me." I didn't respond. I just forwarded it to my lawyer. And then? I blocked him. Because James wasn't my problem anymore. He never was. Final thought. Some people spend their lives underestimating the wrong person. James thought I was helpless. He thought I was nothing without him. But in the end, he learned the hard way. I wasn't his failure. He was mine. And I